Blizzard dropped some last-minute heat in the 07 patch, and if you're wondering why augmentation was nerfed, it's because they were doing this. Anyway, there were some much-needed buffs to some of the most frustrating specs to play in PvP, and we're here to break it down. But let's be honest, PvP is super frustrating in general these days. Remember when knowing that you could death CC made you a good priest? These days, you need to be 100% dialed in, even at lower ratings. And there's another problem. Rank 1 streamers don't even know how good the average player actually is. They'll give obvious advice like press CDs or don't get juked, without realizing that 90% of players already know these things. Rarely will they tell you some of the actual mechanics that really work in PvP. Take interrupting, for instance. These days, it's actually bad to kick fast. Players are so good at juking that trying to be fast will probably donate a precog for free, making you look like a noob. The best players, like Chanimal, do what is called late kicking, which means using your interrupt super late into the cast. This is broken for several reasons. Number 1, people are significantly less likely to juke at the very end of their cast anyway, and number 2, by kicking late, you make your opponent waste time by fake casting over and over. Late kicking is just one of the hundreds of mechanics you can learn at skillcap.com, where we focus on teaching what can actually increase your rating. We've got hundreds of videos including class courses, role tips, positioning guides, and a brand new course that teaches you how to counter every class in the game. We focus on teaching WoW from your perspective, with our ultimate goal of making sure you improve. And that's why we offer a 400 rating gain guarantee. If you don't rank up, you don't pay. It's as simple as that. To get access to hundreds of exclusive guides, be sure to click that discount link below. Alright, back to the video. Let's kick things off with every major change coming to melee DPS. Unholy Death Knight was the first of many weak specs to see buffs, as Death Coil and Scourge Strike both received pretty significant buffs, but will this solve all of their issues? Unfortunately, we don't think so. Look, getting buffs to a builder and spender are nice, but as we've mentioned a few times in the past, Unholy was so drastically nerfed in the early expansion that it's going to need a lot more to fully recover. In fact, for a few weeks, Unholy was arguably the worst DK spec in the game, with both Blood and Frost performing incredibly well. And speaking of which, Frost also got some fairly weird changes aimed at their Deathbringer build with a key damage buff to Reaper's Mark, which hasn't seen too much play in PvP. Reaper's Mark is part of the two-handed Frost DK build, which sacrifices a lot of consistent damage for a big all-in. It's a playstyle that can work in 3v3, but is a bit harder to pull off in solo shuffle. In any case, Frost DKs were already doing pretty good after their buffs a few weeks ago, and we're going to stop being cowards and put them on the high tiers where they belong. Overall, we predicted the gap between Frost and Unholy will be a bit smaller, but they're still both lagging behind other melee. Anyway, the next melee to see some pretty big changes are Demon Hunters, who are also getting some damage buffs for the second time in a row, most notably to the Hunt and Chaos Strike, which are more significant than the auto attack buffs they got last time around. We think DH will be a true wild card this week. If we're being honest, Demon Hunter might be a bit underrated. While their overall toolkit is strong, they just lack the punchy burst windows that have historically made them S tier. While more sustained damage buffs help, what the spec probably needs more is a buff to Blade Dance. Next up is Windwalker Monk, which was the only melee to actually get nerfed in the patch, with Touch of Karma becoming significantly weaker and Blackout Kick getting its previous buff partially reverted. As a result, we will be moving Windwalker Monk back down to the A tier. While the patch did buff Shadow, Pan, and Fists of Fury, these don't offset the nerf to Touch of Karma. One of the reasons we ranked Windwalker so high is because it has some of the best defensives in solo shuffle, which may no longer be the case. We expect Windwalker Monk to be good, but definitely not as dominant as the other high-tier melee. Arms Warriors are in a similar boat and will now be marginally better thanks to a few more minor damage buffs. We should also note that Fury got yet another buff to Mountain Thane, which once again doesn't really matter. And we're also going to make the decision to move Fury Warrior up half a tier since it's clearly doing well across the entire ladder. Overall, we expect this week's changes to help close the gap a little bit more between these specs, with Fury still in the lead. And that brings us to our updated melee tier list for the new patch. Despite getting 0 changes, we have moved Outlaw up since it's clearly one of the best specs in the game, at least at higher ratings, and does exceptionally well in caster lobbies. We've also moved Ret Paladin and Assassination Rogue up too, since they seem to be performing better than we expected last time. Oddly enough, Feral did get indirectly buffed, which we will explain later when we get to healers, and for now, it seems to be neck and neck with Outlaw for best melee in the game. Now it's time to move on to all the changes happening to range DPS. In some very minor news, Balanced Druid got a very tiny damage buff to a build it doesn't even play. Don't ask us why, but Blizzard decided that Lunar Calling needed a buff. This is a hero talent in a build that virtually 0 Balanced Druids are playing in solo shuffle, since it is not only weaker, but is a bit more awkward to play. Damage is definitely not the biggest problem with boomies, and they'll continue being a high tier spec this patch. Now, oddly enough, Augmentation of Ochre got some burst damage nerfs, despite the fact that they are one of the lowest populated specs in the game. But they might have been flying under the radar since their one-shot was actually pretty nasty. With that said, Devastation actually got a small buff to its burst with a 20% buff to Pyre, which shoot out automatically with every Dragon Rage. Overall, this is a net positive, but we don't think this changes their ranking much at all. Dev is one of those specs that has been consistently good this whole expansion and is an absolute menace to deal with for melee DPS, and we fully expect it to perform well in the new patch. The spec to see the most changes this patch is Marksmanship Hunter, who for the second time in a row is getting some damage buffs, most notably to Black Arrow. Will these be enough to pull people away from Beast Mastery? Probably not, especially since BM is getting 0 nerfs with the patch. Yes, that's right, another patch of dominance from everyone's favorite pet class. Moving on, we have some changes to Arcane and Fire Mage, as Sun Fury is getting buffed for what feels like the 10th time in a row. Will this matter? Probably not. Frostfire is just too good for fire thanks to that sweet meteor burst, and Spellslinger is just too convenient to play for Arcane. While Sun Fury is one of those specs that might work on paper, it's just not too practical in PvP. The same can be said for these elemental buffs, with Blizzard once again buffing another hero spec that sees almost 0 play in PvP. Look, as much as one of the devs wants Ellie to fulfill their class fantasy of becoming Zeus and slinging lightning bolts, it's just much easier to become an Italian chef and sling meatballs instead. Up next, we have some Warlock buffs, starting with Affliction, but don't panic since they're only getting some very small damage buffs for PvE reasons. One of these buffs is to Oblivion, which can hit pretty hard if the stars align, but do you know what also hits hard? Haunt and Shadow Bolt. Warlock was already one of the best specs in the game, and that trend will continue into the new patch. Destro is where things get a bit interesting, as Chaos Bolt is getting a damage buff, while Wither is getting a bit of a nerf, which could make Diabolist the move in the new patch. Destro has been one of those specs which has been a bit under the radar so far this expansion, and while we don't expect its relative power level to change by much, it is a bit of a wild card. That brings us to our updated range tier list, where there is significantly less movement. We've adjusted our previous rankings, moving both Shadow Priest and Demo Warlock up half a tier, since they're seeming to perform consistently well in Solo Shuffle. So, what do you guys think? Are we going to be in a melee meta or ranged meta for the new patch? And while you're debating in the comments, let's wrap things up with our healer changes. Up first are Resto Druids, who are finally seeing buffs after what seems like an eternity of being one of the worst healers in the bracket. Now, 5% might not seem like much, but it's actually a pretty big deal, since not only does it affect every heal, but makes every healing modifier slightly better too. It also potentially creates a snowball effect, where doing more healing makes it easier to land those much-needed cyclones. Overall, we're very optimistic about Resto Druid, and we will be moving it up to the A tier for this patch. Continuing with the theme of Blizzard buffing specs nobody is playing, Mistweaver is seeing a very odd buff to its Celestial Hero spec, with Conduit now doing more healing. Ever since their rework and the adaptation to the new Hybrid spec, Mistweavers exclusively play Master of Harmony. So, does this change mean anything? No. Next up is Holy Paladin, who, among a few minor changes, are actually getting a decent nerf thanks to a bug fix, with the Tempered in Battle healing effect no longer working in crowd control. For the unaware, this worked like a passive Spirit Link totem for the Paladin, which even worked in Cyclone, and was one of the main reasons why Paladin has seemed so broken in the past few weeks. While we don't expect Paladin to feel a tier weaker, it does make the healing field way more competitive, especially after buffs to some underperformers. Speaking of which, before we move on to Holy Priests, Disc got another buff to Void Weaver, which doesn't really matter in Solo Shuffle since Oracle is still significantly better. Holy Priest, on the other hand, got another flat buff to Flash Heal, and while this is exciting news, we think they are still the worst healer. Based on our calculations, multiplying 15% by 0 is still 0, and we fully expect Holy to have some healing problems going into the new patch. Right now, Disc is simply better in every way possible. With better CDs, it's just better equipped to handle this bursty meta. That brings us to Resto Shamans, who got 2 sets of buffs, one aimed at their mana and another aimed at healing output, which make their totemic build even better. These buffs are definitely better than what they got a few weeks ago, and as a result, Shaman will be joining Resto Druid on the A tier. Once again, any healing buff has a snowball effect for any healer, allowing them to more flexibly do offensive things, which is certainly good for a traditionally offensive healer. That brings us to our updated healer tier list, where things are now looking a little more balanced, unless you're a Holy Priest, of course. The top 4 still seem to be far ahead, but that gap is slowly closing. By the way, our update to the skill-capped UI might just be the most broken thing we've ever made. In less than a minute, you can instantly install the best interface for PvP as everything is set up right in front of your eyes. And with our brand new update, you can now toggle between PvP and PvE with the click of a button, giving you zero compromise no matter what content you play. Skill-capped members can unlock exclusive profiles for both game modes, while getting instant access to hundreds of videos including class courses, role tips, positioning guides, and a brand new course that teaches you how to counter every class in the game. Best of all, everything we offer is backed up by a rank-up guarantee. If you don't gain at least 400 rating while using our service, you'll get a full refund, no questions asked. So, what are you waiting for? Click the link in the description below and start your journey today.